Welcome to Betrayal and Revenge. I'm your storyteller, and today I'll take you on a journey of secrets, lies, and payback. Make sure you stay with me until the very end. You won't want to miss how it all unfolds. And when it's over, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let me know what you think. I was supposed to be dead. Not metaphorically. Not emotionally. Not dead to them. As some dramatic expression of family exile. No, I mean officially, formally, legally dead. I learned of my passing on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, as I returned from a doctor's appointment, clutching a pharmacy bag and a cup of tea that had gone cold during the cab ride. My knees had been aching again, the dull throb reminding me that I was nearing 70, not 75, as my daughter insisted on rounding up during her passive-aggressive birthday toasts. The house smelled of eucalyptus and cinnamon, the diffuser still misting gently in the corner. Evidence of the small, quiet life I had built for myself after years of raising everyone else. And then I got the call. It was from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in a few years, Margaret, my former neighbor from when I lived in the larger home before the divorce. Her voice was trembling and rushed, barely coherent. "Eleanor," she gasped. "Oh my God, are you? Am I what?" There was silence on the line, a deep inhale, and then, "They said you died. It was in the paper. I was at the service this morning. There was a photo. A eulogy. Eleanor, they buried you." I stood very still. So still that the tea bag inside the cup no longer floated but sank, quietly, like a body in a still pond. "Margaret," I said, with a calmness that surprised even me. "Can you send me a copy?" It arrived within the hour. A scan of the obituary, clipped from the local newspaper, complete with the funeral announcement. My name. My date of birth. A brief, shallow write-up that felt more like a press release than a memorial. Beloved mother and grandmother. Lover of gardening. Generous to a fault. Survived by her 2 children and 5 grandchildren. All of whom she adored endlessly. Adored endlessly. I stared at those words for a long time. There was no mention of my work. No mention of my advocacy in domestic abuse shelters. No reference to the nonprofit I had helped build during the bleak years after the divorce. They hadn't even included the name of the school I taught at for 22 years. I wasn't a woman with a legacy. I was reduced to a bullet point in someone else's narrative. But the true blow came in the next attachment. A photo snapped by Margaret at the church. There they were. My son, Peter, standing tall and composed in the front row, shaking hands like he was hosting a networking event. My daughter, Julia, in all black, dabbing fake tears beneath oversized sunglasses, the same kind she wore when she pretended to mourn her 3rd divorce. My grandchildren, some bored, some scrolling through phones, one chewing gum with her arms crossed like this was a forced school assembly. And there, at the altar, a blown-up portrait of me from 10 years ago, smiling in the sun, my head tilted just so, in a picture I didn't even remember being taken, framed with white lilies, surrounded by candles. I hadn't spoken to them in 8 months. The fallout had been ugly but quiet. Peter accused me of overstepping when I refused to sign the condo over to his name for estate planning reasons. Julia, in turn, demanded I stop emotionally blackmailing her by asking for help with medical appointments or groceries. When I mentioned the word will in passing, their tone shifted in unison, from indifference to calculation. I wasn't their mother anymore. I was a vault. And apparently, they had grown tired of waiting for the key. So they made a choice. They held a funeral. Without a body. Without confirmation. Without even calling my doctor or asking the neighbors or checking the utilities. They declared me dead. Publicly. Legally. Ceremonially. They printed programs. They read eulogies. They cried crocodile tears over a woman who was still alive, drinking ginger tea and wondering if she had imagined the whole thing. But I wasn't surprised. Not really. What shocked me wasn't that they erased me. It was how easy it had been. One phone call to a newspaper. One social media post. One staged funeral, and I was gone from their world. Just like that. But here's the thing. You don't get to bury someone alive and walk away. You don't get to profit from the illusion of grief while the woman you tried to erase is still breathing. And you certainly don't get to inherit anything from a ghost who's just learned how to haunt you back. In the first 24 hours after discovering my premature obituary, I experienced a kind of surreal stillness, as though the world had suddenly tilted just a few degrees, and I was the only one who noticed. Everything around me looked the same. My kettle still whistled at 6 a.m., the neighborhood cat still sat on my front porch like it paid rent, and the sun still rose across the backyard fence, but something fundamental had cracked open beneath it all. I wasn't just estranged anymore. I was erased. And if I'd learned anything from raising two ungrateful children, and surviving a man who used to compare my laugh to a leaky faucet, it was this: when they silence you, you listen harder. So I began with silence. No dramatic confrontation. No angry phone calls. No messages demanding answers. Just observation. Just note-taking. I sat in the calm center of the storm and let it swirl, while I gathered every piece of the twisted puzzle they had unknowingly invited me to complete. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. Not the family lawyer Peter liked to refer to when trying to intimidate me into signing over assets, but the one I had secretly retained a few years ago, Melissa Brooks, a steely woman in her 50s with a voice like tempered glass and a brain sharp enough to cut through legal ambiguity like butter. When I told her what had happened, there was a pause on the line. Then she said carefully, "Eleanor, if there's an obituary and a funeral, and people think you're dead, have you checked your bank accounts?" My stomach dropped. 10 minutes later, I logged in. Most of my accounts were untouched. But the largest one, the trust account with nearly 7 figures I had put aside after selling my post-divorce investment property, was frozen. The access credentials had been updated. A power of attorney had been submitted, under Julia's name. And that's when I knew. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a plan. They hadn't just buried me in print. They had filed legal documents, forged signatures, fabricated death certificates, all to unlock the only thing they had ever truly valued from me: money. Melissa's tone grew icier by the minute as we reviewed document scans and system logs. The death certificate had been signed by a doctor I had never heard of, in a state I had never lived in. The listed place of death? A hospice center in Colorado. I had never been to Colorado in my life. "It's a shell operation," Melissa muttered. "They're using a network of falsified death records to bypass next of kin protocols. Probably through an estate fraud ring, likely online. But the most dangerous part is that they used your children as legitimate anchors. That makes it look real to the banks." I sat there, tea still in my hands, now cold and shaking. "They killed me," I whispered. "On paper. They killed me so they could collect before I was inconvenient." Melissa was already drafting motions to challenge the legal filings and freeze every transaction that had occurred in the last 60 days. She said she'd seen inheritance fraud before, but never a case quite like this. Never so cold. So clinical. So deliberate. But this wasn't just about stolen money anymore. It was about identity. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the dusty cedar chest in my bedroom closet. The one filled with old journals, yellowed family photos, school certificates from when the children were still small enough to look up at me with admiration instead of calculation. I flipped through letters they'd written in crayon, read notes from long-forgotten birthdays, found a card from Peter when he'd graduated law school that said, "I wouldn't be here without you, Mom." Lies, all of it now. Because the boy who had once held my hand in a crowded auditorium had now signed off on my disappearance. And his sister had filed the paperwork. The days that followed passed like a fever dream. Half reality, half disbelief. My waking hours tangled with images of smiling betrayals, and the echo of my own name spoken in past tense. Every ping of an email, every envelope in the mailbox, every ring of the phone sent a jolt through me. It was like grieving my own death from the wrong side of the coffin. Melissa worked fast. Within 48 hours, we had frozen the fraudulent power of attorney Julia submitted. The banks cooperated quickly once we presented evidence that I was very much alive. But that wasn't enough. I didn't want to just undo what they had done. I wanted to know why, and how long they had planned it. So I began digging, not just with lawyers, but with curiosity sharpened by a lifetime of reading between the lines. I knew my children. I had raised them, listened to their lies as toddlers, their manipulations as teenagers, their half-truths as adults. And now I needed to read their movements like a surgeon reads vital signs. I started with Julia. She'd always been dramatic, charismatic to strangers, venomous at home. Her job history was a blur of overambition and underperformance. Recently, she'd lost her position at a boutique real estate firm, but pretended on social media that she was pivoting to consulting. I found out, through a friend of a friend, that she'd maxed out 3 credit cards, was being sued by a former client, and had defaulted on a car lease. She was broke and desperate. Next came Peter, my son, the golden boy with the sharp jawline and dull conscience. A corporate lawyer by title, but always too eager to take shortcuts. Divorce number 2 had drained him. Emotionally, yes, but more importantly, financially. Alimony, child support, property settlements. It all added up. And with a lifestyle he couldn't maintain, he had started looking elsewhere to fill the void. That's when it hit me. They hadn't planned this together from the start. Peter had orchestrated it. Julia had followed. And he had convinced her, with his lawyer speak, his logical tone, his patronizing reassurances, that this was merely anticipatory estate structuring. That it was legal. That it was inevitable. After all, I was old. I lived alone. I had been sick last winter, hadn't I? She'll be gone soon anyway, I imagined him saying, perhaps over wine in Julia's condo, the same one I co-signed years ago. She'd want us to have it. Why let it rot in probate? They'd rationalized it. They'd turned me into an asset. A stock option. A risk to mitigate. The funeral wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. They needed to make it public, dramatic, final. To secure sympathy, to prevent suspicion, to quiet the extended family who might ask questions. So they crafted an event. Booked a venue. Hired a florist. Printed pamphlets. They performed my death. And everyone applauded. But what chilled me most was the thought of what would have happened if I'd died for real. If I had fallen asleep one night and never woken up. There would have been no love in that funeral. No sorrow. Just relief. They would have stood at the podium and cried on cue, while their lawyers filed transfer papers backstage. I started printing everything. Every photo. Every bank statement. Every legal form with forged signatures. I compiled it into a binder, thick and heavy, titled simply, Afterlife. Because now, that's what I was living. A second life. Reborn not through tragedy, but through betrayal. And in this afterlife, I would not be silent. I began sending letters. Not to Julia or Peter, but to the institutions they had lied to. The hospital whose fake certificate had enabled their fraud. The funeral home that hosted the service without a body. The financial advisor who had signed off on suspicious forms without verifying identity. I didn't accuse, I asked questions. Their reactions told me everything. 2 apologized. 1 panicked. Another tried to deny involvement before quietly offering to cooperate. Melissa was impressed. You're building a case stronger than mine, she said one evening after reviewing my new files. I'm not building a case, I replied. I'm building an army. Because this wasn't just about recovering stolen money. It was about reclaiming the truth, making the world see what they tried to erase, and preparing for the moment when I would no longer be a name whispered in past tense, but a woman who walked back in, alive, breathing, and ready to bury the ones who tried to bury her. The first step of resurrection was not dramatic. It wasn't walking into a boardroom with a camera crew, or storming into a courtroom screaming about betrayal. No, that would have been satisfying in the short term, but I wasn't interested in theatrics. I had already had my theatrical moment, performed for me by my children, no less. Now I wanted results. It began with a photograph. A soft, unassuming image, taken by a librarian friend who volunteered at the community center downtown. She snapped it on her phone, me helping her set up a book drive, laughing with my coat half open, holding a cup of coffee with both hands. It was casual, accidental, but I looked alive, which of course I was. I asked her if I could post it on the center's Facebook page. She hesitated at first. Wasn't your family just? But I smiled and said, I think it's time I let the world know I'm feeling better. The post went up quietly. Eleanor joined us this week to help launch our spring literacy drive. So lucky to have her energy back in the building. No hashtags. No tags. No mentions. But the world is smaller than people realize. And it didn't take long. By the next morning, the post had 37 comments and nearly 100 shares. Not viral by internet standards, but viral enough for a small, socially interconnected town where everyone knows someone who once dated your cousin. 3 days later, a message landed in my inbox. It was from an acquaintance I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Eleanor? Is this really you? I heard you were gone. I'm so sorry for your loss. Wait, or is this a mistake? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The image spoke for itself. But the rumor mill had begun turning, and with every half-truth corrected by a glimpse of my face in the real world, my resurrection gained momentum. Then came the whispers. A bank manager called Melissa after a junior employee spotted me walking out of the co-op office. An old church friend left a voicemail saying her niece had definitely seen me buying oranges at the farmer's market. A neighbor stopped in her tracks as I crossed the street one morning and dropped her coffee. It was working. I wasn't just alive. I was haunting them. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to send a single warning. All I had to do was exist. Quietly, publicly, undeniably. Then came the article. A local lifestyle blog, run by a former student of mine, did a short feature on the community center's literacy program. She interviewed me briefly, took a portrait, and posted it with the headline, "The graceful return of a local hero, Eleanor Whitmore back in action." The piece was lovely, poised, vague enough not to stir controversy, but loud enough to confirm what everyone was now wondering. Didn't she die? That was the turning point. Melissa called me 2 hours after the article went up. Her voice was tight. "They know." Peter's lawyer reached out, subtle panic, veiled with legal language. "They're worried you're building a public narrative." I chuckled. "I'm not building anything. I'm just living." That's exactly what they're afraid of. And that's when I decided to go further. The next day, I mailed copies of my certified birth certificate, social security verification, and notarized living affidavit to every financial institution involved in the posthumous estate transition. Each envelope came with a single cover letter, handwritten, signed in ink. "For your records, I am very much alive." No drama. No demands. Just truth. But truth, when sharpened and dropped into a nest of lies, explodes like a grenade. Peter was the first to break. It happened late on a Thursday night, after the article had spread through enough private group chats and back channels to reach the legal circles he liked to orbit in. He called me directly, no warning, no buffer, just raw, unfiltered urgency. I didn't answer. I let it ring. Twice. Then a third time. Then voicemail. His message was breathless, clipped, devoid of any warmth. "Mom, it's Peter. I heard some things. I don't know what's going on or what you're doing, but you can't just, look, we need to talk. Julia's freaking out. Call me." I didn't. Instead, I turned off the lights in the kitchen, poured myself a glass of wine, and listened to the wind hum against the window panes like a song only I could hear. Let them panic. Let them feel the vacuum I had lived in for years, the confusion, the instability, the knowing that something is wrong but not being able to control it. The next day, Julia came in person. She didn't knock. She banged. Fists against wood, hysteria disguised as authority. I watched her through the peephole for a long minute. She looked thinner, haggard. Her makeup was running. Her blouse was unbuttoned at the top like she'd dressed in a rush. There was something desperate in her shoulders, like a child who's lost their mother in a grocery store, but too proud to cry. I opened the door slowly. Her eyes widened. "Jesus Christ, Mom." "Hello, Julia." What the hell are you doing?" I leaned against the doorframe, calm, measured. "I'm alive. Obviously." "That's not what I mean," she snapped. "You're everywhere. Facebook, the paper. People are calling me, asking if we faked your funeral. What am I supposed to say?" I tilted my head. "Maybe start with the truth." That shut her up. For a moment. Then the tears came. Big ugly ones. Not from sorrow, but fear. She started pacing, babbling about Peter, about legal consequences, about how she didn't know the papers he gave her were real legal filings, and how she thought it was just for taxes, and how none of this was supposed to blow up. I said nothing. Let her unravel. Let the silence burn. Finally, she stopped. I could go to jail, Mom. You should have thought of that before you filed a death certificate for someone still breathing. Her mouth opened, closed. Her eyes darted away. It wasn't my idea. Peter, he said you were senile, that you wanted to protect the estate, and this was just a formality, a safeguard. I didn't think. Her voice cracked, and for the first time I saw it. Not guilt, not shame, self-preservation. She wasn't here because she regretted erasing me. She was here because she needed me to erase what they had done. You want me to protect you, I said quietly. She nodded slowly. But you didn't protect me. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the second hand ticking on the hallway clock. Then, with practiced gentleness, I closed the door. And I locked it. She stood there for a while. I could hear her breathing through the wood. Then the footsteps. Then the car starting. Then nothing. That evening Melissa called. They reached out again. Through another lawyer. Offering mediation. I smiled. Of course they did. You're not taking it, are you? No, I said simply. They didn't want a mother. They wanted a memory. So I gave them one. I wasn't finished. Not even close. I had watched them speak at my funeral, cry for an inheritance, forge a death certificate, and laugh behind my back. Now they would watch me live. Publicly. Proudly. And if that terrified them? Good. Because the next time I appeared in a room uninvited, it would be at the reading of a very different kind of document. The first step of revenge was not fire. It was paperwork. I walked into the courthouse with a file the thickness of a small encyclopedia, dressed in a tailored navy coat, hair pinned into a bun so tight it might have held a grudge of its own. My shoes clicked sharply down the hallway like punctuation marks, deliberate, final. At the front desk, I handed over the binder with a calm smile, and 4 words that would ripple through the lives of my children like a crack in a dam. I'm filing formal charges. Identity theft. Fraud. Estate manipulation. False declaration of death. Illegally submitting a forged power of attorney. Misappropriation of assets. Civil liability for reputational harm. And a formal request for a full audit of any property, transaction, or account linked to my name over the last 6 months. The clerk raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask questions. She just stamped the first page and handed me a receipt. By noon, Melissa had already initiated proceedings with the state bar against Peter. His license was now under review for potential ethical violations. If the court determined he knowingly used forged documents, he could be disbarred. Permanently. That was phase 1. Phase 2 was quieter, but sharper. I updated my will. The new version was 29 pages long. Every cent of my estate, including the condo, the trust, the royalties from my academic work, and even the long-forgotten antique jewelry that Julia once bragged about inheriting, was reallocated. Not to them. To shelters. To scholarship funds. To community clinics. To the literacy program that had featured me in the article. To people who had helped me after the funeral, when they thought I was a grieving friend rather than the actual, unburied corpse. I left nothing to Peter and Julia. Not a dime. Not a book. Not a photograph. Not a mention. They wouldn't even be notified by mail. The executor would hand-deliver the document on the day of my real funeral, whenever that may come. And then I bought a full-page ad in the Sunday paper. Not slander. Not accusations. Just a story. A woman erased by her own children. Declared dead while alive. Forgotten, exploited, and reborn. I didn't sign it with my full name. I signed it EW. And let the world do the math. I watched as emails poured into my inbox. Messages from strangers. Women who said the story mirrored their own. Grown children who apologized for thinking less of their mothers. Lawyers who quietly offered free consultations, in case you need reinforcements. And then came the fallout. Julia's employer, already weary from her missed deadlines and strange absences, placed her on administrative leave, pending a review of her conduct. Peter's firm released a vague internal memo about reputation integrity and client-facing trust. Melissa sent me a copy anonymously with a wink emoji. And still, I said nothing to them. I never answered Peter's texts. I never returned Julia's calls. I let the silence thicken into something they couldn't breathe through. I became the ghost they couldn't bury, the woman they tried to erase, who now owned every room they entered, every rumor they tried to suppress, every moment of shame that trailed behind them like a shadow they couldn't explain. And the best part? I hadn't even shown up in person yet. Not really, because true revenge isn't when you scream. It's when they see you smile and realize you've already won. It happened on a Thursday, the annual Whitmore Lecture Series, an event named in honor of my late husband, once a renowned literature professor, and later, a symbolic family tradition. Every spring, Peter and Julia attended the gala dinner. Smiles plastered, wine glasses in hand, always seated front and center with carefully practiced grief for the father they had adored in public and abandoned in practice. This year, they were given the honor of introducing the keynote speaker. I was not on the guest list, but I was already on the program. As the final speaker, I had arranged it through the organizing board weeks ago, under my maiden name, and with Melissa handling logistics. No one had questioned it. Why would they? Dead women don't speak. But I did. That evening, I arrived in a floor-length black dress, simple but unmistakably elegant. My silver hair was swept into a low twist, my heels sharp, my expression serene. I moved through the lobby unnoticed at first, just another guest among donors and academics. Until the room quieted. I stepped onto the stage, thanked the host, and turned to face the audience. Julia dropped her glass. Peter went pale. My voice, when I spoke, was even, clear. No anger. No trembling. I was told I died this year. That there was a funeral. That my name was spoken in eulogies by people who once called me mother. A nervous ripple passed through the crowd. The dean of the university leaned forward, eyebrows raised. I continued. I was declared dead not by illness, not by accident, but by paperwork. By convenience. By a system that accepted a forged death certificate before it ever asked if I had a pulse. Peter half rose from his chair. I ignored him. For months, I watched as my accounts were seized, my home nearly sold, and my legacy carved up by the people I once nursed through fever and heartbreak. They mourned me publicly, while privately attempting to profit from my disappearance. I paused, then delivered the line I had waited to say for months. But I never gave them the satisfaction of a corpse, only a comeback. The room fell completely silent. Tonight, I speak not as a victim, nor as a mother. I speak as a witness, to what it means to survive betrayal by blood, to outlive the funeral they planned, to rise, not in vengeance but in clarity, with no more illusions, no more silence, no more mercy. Julia had her hands over her face now. Peter had sat down, shoulders hunched. They had become children again, not the proud, public heirs of an academic legacy, but two small figures at the center of a storm they started, but could never control. I left the stage to a standing ovation. Not for spectacle, but for survival. Afterwards, people swarmed me. Colleagues. Former students. Strangers who had read the article and pieced it together. One woman, maybe 30 years old, took my hand and whispered, "You just said everything my mother never could." And then she cried. I left without looking back. That night, a new article was published. The mother who survived her own funeral. It spread far beyond the local news. Forums picked it up. Podcasts invited me. Advocates against elder abuse reached out. A small press offered to publish my story. And as for Peter and Julia, they hid. Peter quietly resigned from his firm. Julia disappeared from social media. Their circles shrank. Invitations dried up. Whispers replaced applause. Because the one thing they feared more than being caught was being seen. And now, everywhere they went, they were followed by the ghost of a woman who refused to die. Not in body. Not in silence. Not in legacy. I had risen. And they would never forget it. In the months that followed, life did not return to what it had been. It became better. Not richer, not louder, just clearer. My days were no longer spent anticipating phone calls from children who never called, or checking mailboxes for birthday cards that never came. I stopped setting places at the table for people who only saw me as a bank account with a face. And in that absence, I discovered something extraordinary: space. Space for music again. Space for walking barefoot through the garden with no agenda. Space for laughter that wasn't bitter. And space for people who hadn't just remembered me after I died, but who showed up now, because I was alive. The local university invited me to speak again. This time, not about trauma, but about reinvention. I sat on a panel with women half my age, and watched as they took notes when I spoke. They didn't look at me like an old woman with a sad story. They looked at me like someone who had won something. And I had. I had won back my name. I had won back my narrative. I had even won a quiet letter from Julia, unsigned, mailed from an untraceable P.O. box. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just 4 words scribbled in tight, ashamed handwriting. I was so wrong. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but because the silence had finally shifted. It was no longer theirs to weaponize. It was mine to preserve. Peter never contacted me again. I sometimes imagined him in his apartment, gray light through the window, scrolling through news stories with my name in them. Never commented on, never liked, but read, watched, remembered. Let them live in the shadows. I had walked through mine, and emerged intact. I didn't throw out the funeral pamphlets. I kept them tucked in a drawer. Not as bitterness, but as evidence. A reminder of just how far people are willing to go when they believe you have no voice. But I do. And I use it every day now. To speak. To laugh. To live. And when the real day comes, when my body finally rests and the world says goodbye for good, there won't be any lies in the air. No forged signatures. No false sobs. Just the truth. That I walked through death once. And came back better. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to Betrayal and Revenge, give us a like, and hit the bell so you won't miss new tales. Share your thoughts in the comments. I value your feedback. See you in the next stories of Betrayal and Revenge.